No, you're fine. Okay, we'll get started here. My name is Rachel Rudolph. I'm the Extension Vegetable Specialist at the University of Kentucky. My focus is on commercial vegetable production, so that's what we're going to be focused on today is commercial level production. But honestly, from my standpoint, the scale of your farm doesn't matter as much as, are you selling this for a profit or, compared to just for fun or for your food for your family, right? So that's it's not so much scale from my perspective. So we're going to be focused on high tunnel production. Just so I have an idea, how many of you already have a high tunnel on your property? 2, 3, okay, 4. Great. So we'll for those of you who don't have a high tunnel and are interested in high tunnels, I think I'll cover some of those basics, but if I don't and you have questions, we can definitely chat about that too. So for high tunnel production, per square foot, tomatoes are the most high value crop you can grow, right? And with that in mind, that really encourages a lack of rotation, right? Because if this is the most profitable thing, people say, to themselves, why would I grow anything else, right? Well, this can lead to several issues. Sometimes the high tunnels are underused or unused for long periods of time, right? Because tomatoes are only being grown maybe April through November in many cases. There's a fertilizer buildup in the soil that causes soil salinity and then can lead to decreased yield and abiotic disorders for your future crop, right? Tomatoes are pretty heavy feeders, require quite a bit of fertilizer, especially nitrogen, and sometimes people go overboard. And then, of course, with any lack of rotation, you will eventually see an increase in pest and disease pressure. So really this talk is discussing what other crops could be grown profitably in a high tunnel to rotate with tomatoes to, still get the most out of your tomato crop, right? I understand people would not stop producing tomatoes, but what can we rotate with in a smart, profitable way? So when I'm talking about crop rotation, we're talking about a sequence of crops grown in a specific location. And so that could be cash crops, it could be cover crops or green manures, really anything that is, a sequence of different crops. The crop rotation options are possible in high tunnels, but really require a lot of planning because you've got a confined space. So I think it requires a little bit more thought and planning compared to open field production. And for those of you less familiar with high tunnels, when I'm talking about high tunnels, I'm talking about an unheated covered structure with plants grown in the soil, right? So that's different from a greenhouse where things are in pots and there may be heat or maybe even more controlled environment with a cooling mechanism, right? So that's what we're talking about, passively heated and cooled, and plants are grown in soil. So really, crop rotation, right, you can think of it as changing of crops over both space or location and time. And it's really important for many perspectives, for many reasons, but improving soil quality or maintaining your soil quality and the soil fertility, as well as managing or preventing pests and diseases. So we can rotate based off plant family, so unrelated plants, the nutrient requirements of those different plants that are being rotated, host suitability for certain pests and diseases, rooting depth and type, so varying your rooting depth and type can really help with soil quality, and whether or not you think you need cover crops or green manures. So the limitations, right, and we'll talk about all the options, but the number of tunnels that a grower has can obviously be a limitation, right? If you have one high tunnel That's going to kind of limit how you approach things. But, you know, we have over 1,500 high tunnels in the state of Kentucky right now, which is more than almost every state we are at the top of the list in the United States. Like, aside from maybe California and a few others, high tunnel production has really exploded in Kentucky. So there are a lot of farms that have more than one high tunnel, thanks to cost share programs such as the one from NRCS. So if you have more tunnels, rotation options are obviously more possible. There's more creativity there, room for creativity. But you're also going to be limited by your market, right? Where are you selling? What are your customers expecting? That kind of thing. Your motivation and interest for growing other crops is obviously going to be a limitation. The time you have to devote to this, and your labor, right? Is it just you? Do you have a crew? Do you have a farm crew? Is it just family, right? And learning how to manage a diversity of crops at the same time, maybe. So we'll talk about rotational options within beds in one high tunnel, and I'll give you some examples. Similar crops every year, right? So you would know what to expect, your customers would know what to expect, you'd still have everything that they expect, but they'd be in different locations within the high tunnel. And this could be potentially a lot of maintenance in some respects of fertilizing and running irrigation, right? Because maybe lettuce is perhaps going to need less water than tomato, right? That's a given. Then there's interseasonal rotations where you rotate between seasons within the same calendar year, right? So tomatoes spring to summer, and then you follow with something in the fall and winter. This can help with soil fertility management, and it may help break up some of that pest and disease cycle. And it can be done in one high tunnel, right? But it's still not an ideal rotation strategy to follow that next spring with the same crop, right? So planting tomato year after year is still, you still may see disease and pest buildup. And then there's a multi-year strategy, right? So you would need, in this case, you would need at least 2 tunnels in order to maintain your tomato crop every year. Lots of options for rotations in that case. And that's a longer stretch between tomatoes being in the same place, right? So that is even better from a perspective of breaking up pests and disease cycles. And there's more options for cover cropping in that case, which can really help with soil health and quality. Okay, so here is an example. Let's say each rectangle, so purple, pink, green, 2 reds, right? Each one of those rectangles is a bed in your high tunnel, right? I'm not an artist, so just bear with me, right? This is basic diagram here. So this would be a spring example if you had one high tunnel, right? And you wanted to rotate. So early spring is a good season for cooler season crops with less days to maturity. So thinking about getting something in and out relatively quickly and being ready for summer, right? You want it to get out and then you'll be ready for summer. So again, this is an unheated high tunnel. This is what we're operating under. So you'd have beets there. I'm a little afraid to use this pointer, but I'm really bad at this. Okay, beets are on the far left. And radishes, those are going to be relatively quick days to maturity. They're relatively cold hardy. They can be planted maybe even earlier than March 1st and March 15th, depending on your motivation and your interest there. Broccoli, also very cold hardy, relatively quick days to maturity. So, 60 to 70 days to maturity. You've got your tomatoes in early April. You're going to need row cover in that sense because we will have cold days still. Kale and carrots. So everything but the tomato is pretty quick. The broccoli is probably the next slowest. So those are options, right? Those are cool season options, relatively low maintenance, except for the tomatoes and maybe the broccoli, but the rest of it is pretty low maintenance. Okay, so your summer example. So everything came out except the tomatoes, right? So lettuce, summer squash, you've still got your tomatoes, you put peppers in, cucumbers, and summer squash. And so for summer, it's really important to choose crops that can withstand heat. So for those of you with high tunnels, you know it can get, even with everything open in the high tunnel, it can get over 100 degrees in there. And so you really don't want to mess around with anything that cannot withstand the heat. I have the lettuce there on the far right because that is close to a side that would have a breeze. You could potentially put up some shade cloth. We did successfully grow lettuce in July in Kentucky for a research project. We put up shade cloth. We made sure there was regular irrigation, and it was very successful, right? So it is possible. I was a little nervous about it, but you know it worked. And so lettuce is possible in the middle of summer in Kentucky in a high tunnel. The rest of these crops are very heat tolerant, I would say, and they're the summer squash is going to start producing very quickly. The peppers and the cucumbers may be slower to come on. The tomatoes, if we plant April 1st in a high tunnel, we usually expect fruit by mid-June, which is much quicker than you would experience in field production, right? So normally field-grown tomatoes are planted early May, and they don't come on fruit doesn't come on until sometime in July. So that's the benefit of high tunnel production in general, is things are ready sooner. And usually because they're protected by the structure, it's usually higher quality, higher marketable yield. Okay, so fall's another good time to grow cole crops and things that are, again, going to be cool season tolerant. So you can plant them when it's still pretty warm. The transplants are fairly tolerant to heat as long as you've got good irrigation. One thing I'll say that we have learned from trial and error is really getting them in early enough to get enough growth before daylight starts diminishing and temperatures start dropping. You really want to get some good growth before, let's say, October 15th. Right, or November 1st. So carrots, spinach, lettuce, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, beets, and kale. So if your tomatoes are planted, let's say April 1st, really and truly by mid to late August for us normally, the tomatoes are done, right? You can hang on to them a little bit more, but we end up seeing a lot more unmarketable fruit than marketable fruit. And so certainly by September 1, you could pull those out and plant something else. The Brussels sprouts are really long days to maturity, 100 or so days to maturity depending on the variety, but they are extremely cold tolerant. So those could be there, to Christmas. You could be selling Brussels sprouts right around Christmas. Cauliflower, it's again really important you plant those while it's still warm to get some biomass, some growth on there. So kale, of course, is a reliable standard, and of course lettuce does great in the fall or the spring. So again, some mix of short days to maturity, long days to maturity. This also helps break up the labor, right? So you're not harvesting everything at the same time, especially if it's just you and your partner or, just you. This helps break up the labor. So let's say by winter, you are kind of exhausted, and that is one drawback to high tunnel production, is that it can go all year round, so you really don't get that natural break that field production sees, that people that only grow in the open field see or experience. So for example, we're still doing, my group at the University Research Farm, we are still growing things right now. And so it's kind of exhausting, right? And so let's say, in theory, that you're ready for a small break. You could, once those carrots and beets are done, you could put in some cover crop, right? So you could take up 2 beds and do a cereal rye, very cold tolerant cereal rye cover crop. And so you'd still have your Brussels sprouts. You could still have lettuce depending on the variety, and kale's gonna hang in there as long as you want it to typically. So there's some options, right? It's a great opportunity to build some organic matter, get in a crop that is completely unrelated. That's a great rotational crop, right? And give yourself a break. Okay, so that would be one, those examples are kind of, if you had one high tunnel, those are potential rotations. The important thing for that is really taking notes and making sure you remember, you can refer back to those notes. Okay, what did I have planted here last spring, right? Those kind of things. So interseasonal rotations would be, okay, maybe the whole high tunnel is dedicated to one crop, and then the next season it's dedicated to another crop, right? And this works better, I think, if, one, you've got a very reliable market that you can only sell tomatoes, right? Or you have multiple high tunnels where you can grow other things. So spring and summer, we've got tomatoes, and then followed by fall, winter greens, primarily lettuce. You could do spring, summer tomatoes, and then fall flowers. So this is a project, the fall flowers is a project that my group has been working on for several years, of looking at, how many flower stems can we get in the fall? How cold hardy are things? What's the quality, right? And also, what does this do to the soil, and how much disease and pests do we see, right? So we're kind of looking at all aspects. What was surprising to me is that sunflowers, of all of them, are extremely cold hardy. So zinnias, not so much, but sunflowers, amaranth, those do really well even when the temperature starts to drop. So these have gone, this project, we always go up until Thanksgiving. And so once we get into the 30s, things start to fall off, but from August through November, we can grow quite a few flowers. So that's an option. Here's another option. You could do leafy greens in the late winter, early spring, then get your tomatoes in spring and summer, and then follow with cole crops. For those of you who are, strictly tomato people, I highly encourage, spring, summer tomatoes, and then follow with a cover crop. Get something in that high tunnel even if you're not going to be producing a cash crop. So the one thing to keep in mind is you will still need some irrigation in that high tunnel for your cover crop. A lot of times people would not, supply irrigation for a cover crop if you were in the open field, but in the case of a high tunnel, you at least need some irrigation to get it going. It doesn't need to run every day like you would with your cash crop, but a sprinkler system or something that can help things along on really hot, dry days in the early season, that's still going to be needed. So I think you can see we've got a couple sprinklers up in the high tunnel there. Okay, so multi-year rotations. So there's a lot more options with more than one high tunnel. More success with soil fertility and pest and disease management will come from the longer the rotation is. So the more time in between you planting a tomato crop in the same location, essentially, or any crop for that matter. A lot of planning is required to ensure like best rotation, right? So really the focus here is trying to plant outside of plant family, things that are not related to one another, that won't share the same pests and diseases. That is kind of the focus here. And also different fertility management. So let's say you have 2 tunnels. Very common, actually, here in Kentucky. There are a lot of farms that have more than one. But let's say, so the order is, spring, summer, fall. So year 1, your tunnel would have greens, tomatoes, cole crops. And your other tunnel at that same time would have root crops, cucurbits, and greens. So that could be beets and carrots, cucumbers, and lettuce, right? Year 2, you do a different rotation in the first tunnel with root crops, cucurbits, and greens, and then cole crops, tomatoes, and root crops. So really what you're looking at here is there's at least 2 years. So if you go to year 3, we're back to cole crops, tomatoes, and root crops. So there's at least 2 years where the tomato is not in the same place, right? So that's a nice rotation. That's a decent amount of time to break up pest and disease cycles. And the same with cucurbits. Cucurbits are also a really high value crop. Probably, I think, number 2 or 3 behind tomatoes as far as per square foot in the high tunnel that can be grown. And that's because it's a multi-harvest crop, as tomatoes are, that you can harvest a lot of cucumbers off just one plant, right? And it can go for quite a while. Option 2, right? Obviously, if you've got more than even 2 high tunnels, you've got more options. So the one thing I'll point out is that a lot of flowers are in the Asteraceae family, which is the lettuce family, right? So you wouldn't want to put those in the same rotation. It would be an either-or situation ideally. Not all flowers, so you can definitely Google that and make sure, and then feel free to move forward with other non-aster flowers, but definitely double check that. So yeah, similar to the 2 tunnel, but now you've got a longer rotation. So in this case, you have tomatoes, you still have your tomatoes every year. 1 whole tunnel could be devoted to tomatoes. 1 whole tunnel could be devoted to cucumbers, right? But there's 3 years between the same crop being in the same location. And from a plant pathology standpoint, that is really what they recommend, a minimum of 3 years. Yes? Okay, I can probably send this PowerPoint out too if you all want it. Just leave me your email and I can send that to you. I'm happy to share it. So yeah, that's from a pathology standpoint, that is really ideal, is at least 3 years. The longer the better is what any plant pathologist will tell you. Okay, so crop management, really thinking about, I'll have people say, well, I want to grow pumpkins in a high tunnel. And yes, you can absolutely grow pumpkins in a high tunnel, but why, right? So they take up a lot of ground space. It's not a great use of the space when you think about how many fruit are harvested from a pumpkin plant, right? So you can put, and that's what I would say, is you can put anything in a high tunnel, but should you? Is that the best use of your space? And so thinking about growing up high value, multiple harvests in that high tunnel, that would be ideal. So crop spacing is usually closer than open field planting in a high tunnel. So things are usually a little tighter, and that can be good and bad, right? So the tighter spacing may lead to disease and pest pressure. You do want to think about having enough room for harvesting. And I think a lot of people cram a lot into their high tunnel, and then it's overwhelming, right? When the season comes on and you've got way more tomatoes than you thought you could handle, it becomes overwhelming. So think about how you can best use the space, but also like respect your time and energy. Transplanting versus direct seeding. I highly recommend transplanting as much as possible because it is more resources, but when the transplant's in the ground, you can see it, you know it's there, and you can start managing it immediately. When there is a seed, it's a little more dicey as to is that seed gonna germinate? Is it there? What's happening to it, right? And you also have to start weed management much sooner and more vigorously with a direct seed. Consider crops that allow multiple harvests, right? So cabbage grows great outside. You do not need to grow cabbage in a high tunnel. It's a one harvest crop. It's not the best use of that space. Tomato, cucumbers, lettuce that's cut and come again, all those things, those are great high tunnel crops. Flowers, multiple harvest flowers, those kind of things. So I provided examples on cole crops, and the only reason I said that could be an option in a high tunnel is under, really cold conditions. So most cole crops grow great outside, but if you're really trying to push the boundary on the season and get it into winter, then you may want to grow a cole crop inside, right, inside the high tunnel. Thinking about what you can manage, and make the use of the whole tunnel when possible. So growing vertically when possible. Make sure your tunnel is set up for trellising and can stand that weight. Yes? Yes. Yep. Yes. So mini high tunnel, essentially, it sounds like. So low tunnels, that's a great introduction into high tunnels if you're interested in this kind of production, but you're not quite sure you want to, invest that. Low tunnels are great, or cold frame, those are great introductions into high tunnel production and gets you used to, you probably noticed how warm it gets under, when you raise up the lid of what you were describing. So it was a little frame, right, with plastic. So basically a mini high tunnel, or what we would call a low tunnel. It's really warm under there, right? And there was probably condensation under there in the winter because heat gets trapped, which is what you want. But yeah, that is a great introduction into high tunnels. On a raised bed or just in the... So check it in the sense of irrigation, or what do you mean by checking? For what are you checking it for? Right. So I think the same principle would apply, is rotating a raised bed that's like a permanent raised bed, that is probably even more likely to be susceptible to pests and diseases and that kind of thing. So rotating, being really careful with the fertilizer applications, those kind of things would still apply in that sense. Yeah. And some people have more permanent beds in their high tunnel, and they like it from a management standpoint in the sense of, there's maybe better, easier weed management and those sides, and it looks tidy and that kind of thing, but not renovating the soil as much can lead to pests and diseases. So it's still a something to be aware of for sure. Yeah. You could turn it over, yes, or cover crop, right? I think you could grow a tiny little cover crop right in that space, especially when it's not being used, Yes. So thinking about what you can manage, right? So maybe it's a smaller scale to this. And they do make high tunnels we have several high tunnels that are 15 feet wide, 40 feet long, right? And they're very manageable. You can grow a lot in them, but they are very manageable size, a backyard size essentially. Whereas, what you all may think or what some of you may have are 30 foot by 96 foot, and we have those, and those are massive and can be a little overwhelming. So yeah, you want to make the whole use of the high tunnel as much as possible while still balancing labor and time. And so that's a common issue that I see a lot is people crammed things into their high tunnel, and then at the peak of the season, they're feeling really overwhelmed. So something to think about is, do I want to manage 6 rows of tomatoes, not so well, or do I want to manage 4 rows of tomatoes really well? And I would argue for the latter because you will probably have a higher marketable yield if you really have the time to take care of those fewer rows of tomatoes, right? And so you'll have more time to really take care of things. So the question is about training tomatoes. So some people grow determinate tomatoes in the high tunnel, and that would they grow to about 5 or 6 feet tall, and we often just do a Florida weave. So every 2 plants, there is a piece of rebar or a T-post, right? And then we have just trellis along, just propping things up. That's in the high tunnel. If you have the high tunnel that is built to withstand weight hanging off of it, and there are certain requirements, not all high tunnels are built for that. So, and I say this because one tomato plant can easily can produce 25 pounds of fruit. So if you have 400 tomato plants in a high tunnel, and that weight is hanging on the structure, you definitely want, you all can do the math on that. You definitely want to ensure that your structure is built to withstand that hanging weight. But an indeterminate tomato would be something that you could trellis from the top of the high tunnel and just let it grow. And that can grow to be 10, 12 feet tall. And you can do 2 liters or you can do 1. And in either case, a lot of people do the lower and lean system. We're kind of getting off topic, but, and that is, it's kind of on a pulley, right? So 12 feet tall tomato plant is obviously taller than most people can harvest. So you essentially lower the plant down. It's like a spindly stem, and so it's forgiving, and you can lower it down, harvest from it, and put it back up, right? So that there are 2 different options. So keeping in mind planting windows, successional planting, seeding for continuous availability, this depends on your market, right? Do you want to have beets for 6 months of the year? Do you need that? Is that what your customers want? Or do you just want one short season of beets and move on to something else? Staggered planting every 1 to 2 weeks. Thinking about your labor and your market, the staggered helps kind of alleviate some of the harvest pressure of needing to harvest things right at all the same time. Especially with summer squash, a staggered planting can really help because there's a lot of pest pressure on summer squash, and so those plants may not last as long as you want them to. And so having a new crop coming, that can help. The influences that can affect the timing of rotation, right? The termination of one crop before you plant another, right? From our experience, it's about a week turnover. And that's fast. When we pull the tomato plants out, get the whole tunnel cleaned up and ready for the next crop, you need at least a week. So keeping that in mind, the weather and the climate, there have definitely been times where we were ready to plant something and then we had a cold, especially in the spring. It's like these tomatoes need to get in the ground, but it's going to be 30 degrees tomorrow, right? So we're not going to plant them tomorrow. That's not a good idea, right? So that may delay us by a week or two, depending on the weather. Daylight is also an effect that, if it's too dark, if it's still too dark, right, they may survive, but they're not going to be growing. And so those days to maturity are going to be longer than you planned for, and that's just something to be aware of. And then the market and the labor, right? What does your market need? How much help do you have? Is it just you, right? All of that stuff is going to affect how the rotation and the timing of all of that goes. So this is just kind of zoom in on these flowers. This is our setup. And I would not expect someone to have such an elaborate, this was for research purposes, I would not expect you all to have such an elaborate setup. The sunflowers were successionally direct seeded. So every week, I think in this case it's every 2 weeks we direct seeded sunflowers. So they were staggered. So we weren't harvesting them all at the same time. Everything else was transplanted. Zinnias, cosmos, strawflowers, amaranth, those were all transplanted. You can see this netting probably here on the left. So that is that's Hortonova netting. You can reuse it from year to year. We've had the same netting for many years. It's really good working. It looks like a volleyball net. You can use it horizontally to let things grow up through it, or you can use it vertically like, a volleyball net and let things grow, like cucumbers, grow really well with Hortonova netting. So that's a really nice reusable material for a lot of different purposes. And just zooming in on some of these things. So I'm a vegetable person, right? But this flower project has been pretty interesting in, how we can fit in a different crop compared to, some standard vegetable crop. So these are just some things that we've grown. Anyone that has dealt with the ProCut series of sunflowers, that ProCut red, that wine-colored sunflower, that one we never got to bloom. And I've talked to other people that never got it to bloom either. So it's gorgeous, but I think I got one. The bicolor does great, and that white, light yellow one, that's also a really nice one that does really well. But the red one, in the fall anyway, we got one, I think, the whole time. So the flower management, just some things to keep in mind. If you're thinking about flowers, they are not without pest and disease pressure, just like vegetable crops. And so even caterpillars are an issue on flowers. And I would say the room for error is even smaller than with vegetable crops for flower sales, as far as the bloom needs to look really good, the stems need to look good, everything needs to look perfect, whereas customers may be more forgiving for a less than perfect tomato, right, or a less than perfect beet. So keeping that in mind, but the fertility requirements are lower, and you do get multiple harvests. And just something else is are flowers going to be the focus of your high tunnel production, or is this going to be kind of a side gig? that's a complement to your vegetable production. And then how, and Tara covered this in the previous talk, but thinking about how you would do, if you're going to do value added, are you going to do bouquets or arrangements, or are you just going to sell the stems? It is a lot, flower harvest is a lot of work. It's a lot of harvest, it's a lot of time. There's nothing, you think about flower harvest and it kind of sounds romantic. It is not. It's just a lot of work. It kind of surprised me how much work it was. So keeping that in mind. Okay, so other rotation options. Think of unrelated crops that can be added to the rotation that would be, quote unquote, worth putting into the high tunnel. The high value crops that will add and improve the rotation. You could do alliums maybe, herbs. For those of you who listened to the talk next door, to Cindy Finis's talk, she had a lot of good herb ideas. There's been a lot of talk about strawberries in the high tunnel, and there's kind of a debate about whether those are the best use of the space, right? For as long as the season is and the amount of resources that go into strawberries, is that per square foot, is that worth it? So thinking about rotations, you want to think about the space in your high tunnel, the management requirements, days to maturity, multiple or single harvests, and the market, of course. If you're planning, thinking about your diseases or pests that are already a problem, right? Like, what am I already dealing with? I don't want to put something else in that's going to exacerbate this problem. Sanitation will still be really important. When you're turning things over, you want to clean things and start with new things many times when you're removing one crop and putting another one in. Soil fertility and soil sampling. So if you're going to do these multiple rotations in the year, I highly recommend getting a soil sample every time. A lot can change from one season to the next. So for those of you who do row crop production, that's not a common thing, right? It's maybe every 2 or 3 years you might pull a soil sample with row crops. With vegetable crops, it's bare minimum 1 soil sample a year per field or per high tunnel. And if you're rotating and constantly turning the tunnel over into a new crop, it's good to get a snapshot of what's going on in that high tunnel, because a lot can change. Because it's that protected environment, there's no precipitation happening in that tunnel, we just don't see the weathering and the leaching that you would in the open field. So the soil is less forgiving than in the open field. Okay, so resources, we have a YouTube channel, Vegetable Research and Extension. It's a University of Kentucky. We've got a lot of videos on there. There's a few flower videos, but most of them are vegetable production. And we've got a fact sheet on this rotation with cut flowers if people are interested in that. For anyone who's less familiar with the UK resources, UK ID 36 is the Commercial Vegetable Growers Handbook. It has essentially any vegetable crop. It's alphabetical, and it provides pest and disease management, fertility management, all of that. We have a scouting guide for high tunnels. And of course, many of you may have heard of the UK Center for Crop Diversification. That has a lot of crop profiles, so kind of basic crop information, and then also kind of economic analysis of a lot of different crops. So if you're thinking about like, what is this worth? What could I grow? That's a great resource. And here's a planting calendar for high tunnels. We have 3, so you can see down in the bottom right, Region 2, we're in Region 2, but for anyone that's visiting from other counties, right, there's Region 1 and Region 3. So make sure you get the right planting calendar for your region. These are available online, or I think we have some printed copies around if anyone really wants a printed copy. All right. I'm happy to take any questions or chat with people afterwards. Yes? Yes, yellow shoulder. So he's asking about yellow shoulder of tomato, which is essentially the top part of the tomato is yellow and it looks like it's not quite ripe, but it just never ripens. That's essentially what it kind of looks like. That is a really common issue in high tunnels. So I highly suggest you get a soil sample and get your soil tested. That is likely an issue with lack of potassium. So in a high tunnel, that happens is the potassium over time, after several years, the potassium drops out and the magnesium increases. And that lack of potassium going to the fruit is one of the main causes of yellow shoulder. Yes. No, a basic soil test with UK or with, if you're using Waters lab, will give you potassium. But you need to know, okay, how much potassium should I have, and in relation to the magnesium. So there's a Hart's ratio. You want more potassium compared to magnesium. And so if you put tomato as your crop, you will get a Hart's ratio, and that will tell you your risk for things like yellow shoulder. So the question is, what kind of tomato do I recommend? And it really depends on your market. I grow mostly determinate tomatoes because I think they're just easier to manage as far as the height. But we have had really good luck with BHN 589. That's just a general slicer with a good flavor. But I've worked with a lot of growers that like indeterminates. And Cayman has done really well. That is an indeterminate, large slicer. It's resistant to root knot nematode. So that's done really well in some of the trials we've had. But yeah, it really depends on your market. There's a lot of tomato varieties out there, and there's a lot of really good ones. Any other questions? I can hang around too if people want to chat. Okay, thank you.